Perhaps you might argue we've always been in that world. We've always, as a species, existed in a stew of nonsense and rumor and propaganda and, various interests, et cetera. So maybe on some macro level, it's not so different than where it was in the past. And yet we've, for the last few decades at least, had this kind of commitment to the idea of trying to get things right, to be accurate, to follow some enlightenment principle, to be hypothesis oriented and try to verify things and, et cetera, et cetera. But that may be less important to most people than we think it is.
Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Pachal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building how the business of news will work in the future. This week, I'm excited to talk to Justin Hendrix. Justin is the CEO of Tech Policy Press, and he's spent years interrogating how big tech intersects with democracy, policy, and society. His work often frames technology not just as an industry story, but as a civic one, what it means for the rights of all stakeholders, especially overlooked ones, as well as the future of information. Naturally, that perspective is vital right now as AI transforms media and raises big questions about copyright, fair use, hallucinations, and who's really benefiting from these new systems. With lawsuits flying around and policy fights heating up, I wanted to get Justin's take on what a winning strategy looks like for media going forward. Not just for its survival as a business, but for its role as an information medium in society. We also dig into how the battles over AI echo the last 20 years of tech policy, from Section 230 to antitrust, and what are the lessons media leaders can learn from past clashes with Silicon Valley. And with Google facing a lot of pressure in the courts, there may be new openings for publishers to assert themselves. We get into that too. I found this conversation really thought-provoking. Justin brings a really great historical lens, but also a forward-looking view on how media and policy and AI all fit together. I hope you find the discussion as interesting as I did, and if you do, I'd be really grateful if you'd leave a review for the podcast in whatever podcast app you happen to be listening in. Reviews, especially those on the Apple and Spotify apps, really do help the show. Please leave one if you can. Also, a couple quick notes. I'm offering a monthly class on AI for beginners. It's only 60 minutes, and like everything I do, it's focused on practical takeaways for media professionals, people in journalism, PR, and comms. And it's only $49. Each one's a live class, so it's always up to date, and I guarantee you'll walk away with something you can apply in your day-to-day. You can sign up at mediacopilot.ai. Okay, now it's time for my conversation with Justin Hendrix of Tech Policy Press. Justin, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thank you for having me, Pete.
Our pleasure. So I'm super glad you're here. I know you think a lot about how tech's changing society, and I know there's a lot of people you talk to who examine how public policy should be adapting to changing technology. And AI is massively changing things with respect to media. There's copyright, there's just how it's altering distribution, and just sort of the broader idea of like how people are getting information, what the quality of that information is. I want to get into all that with you, but before we get started, can you tell me just a little bit more about Tech Policy Press, your role there, and basically what informs your perspective on tech and its role in society?
Yeah, I suppose maybe I'll just step back and describe my own trajectory for a moment, how I kind of came to Tech Policy Press. I started my career in media, I guess 25 years ago, working at The Economist, and worked there for about a dozen years in a variety of different roles, not as a journalist, but on the kind of publishing side of the business, but often engaged with content and the way that we produce content about various matters, global politics and economics and finance and science and technology, et cetera. In doing that, I got very interested in tech. I went back to grad school. I studied technology commercialization, entrepreneurship, university tech transfer. I ended up running this consortium in New York City called New York City Media Lab, which was out of NYU and partnered with Columbia and CUNY and other schools here in New York, looking at emerging media technology research and in many cases working with media companies, ranging from the Times to Bloomberg to the Associated Press and more, all looking at that time, how do we apply machine learning in media, but also how do we think about future interfaces? And in doing that, I started teaching a class called Tech, Media, and Democracy with a handful of other faculty at different schools. I still teach that class at NYU, at Cornell Tech. And in doing that, I kind of decided this is what I care about. This is what I really want to do with the remainder of my career. And Tech Policy Press was a kind of side hustle. We, at the time, it was called Protego Press. My co-founder, Brian Jones, and I had been, cobbling this thing together. He'd been putting a lot of effort into it. And around the time of COVID, I kind of thought, hey, what if I sort of put my shoulder into this? We'll see what happens. And took it on full time. And so we sort of relaunched the site in the beginning of 2021 and have been going now for, a little 4 years and trying to make it happen. And through a lot of hard work and a good deal of luck and the support of many individuals from across the community, have been able to grow it into a small nonprofit that has 5 full-time employees, a handful of part-timers, a cohort of fellows spread out around the world, and then, of course, hundreds of volunteer contributors on issues at the intersection of tech and democracy. So I've really just been very pleased at the trajectory of it to date and, hoping that it provides some value to some of these complicated questions that I think we'll get into this morning.
Nice. It just honestly, it almost seems inevitable now that you've sort of described your journey there, having done things with education, on the business side, starting entrepreneurship to sort of culminate in this thing that, this nonprofit that you've created that sort of combines all these things and with the mission to, again, what is the mission? Describe it to me, given all that stuff. Like, what's the elevator pitch for Tech Policy Press?
Yeah, we want to provoke debate and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. That intersection of tech and society. We recognize that, you've got a kind of reflexive relationship now between extremely powerful, widely distributed technologies on the one hand, and the way that people interact with one another, with government, with commerce, with education, with healthcare, with every aspect of our lives. And, to some extent, we see those effects every day. You read them in the headlines. And in many ways, the kind of debate over tech and how tech should work is a debate over who gets to make the rules. And so we're seeing that play out at the highest levels, the kind of commanding heights of the economy, the global economy, the kind of geopolitical circumstances, particularly around AI, which I know we'll get into. And it feels like to me, I don't know, just never been more important.
Yeah, for sure. So, one of the key aspects of democracies is a free press of some kind. And that press, that media institution, kind of needs to be able to sustain itself and thrive going forward. And that's kind of been a challenge in the last couple of years. Now, that's been for complicated reasons. But of course, AI is now becoming a bigger and bigger player within all those reasons. And, this goes beyond just copyright. I don't want to get too big too quickly, but I believe like the whole idea of these systems ingesting lots of content and then, regurgitating answers, or not just regurgitate, I should say, use that word, because that's a very specific sort of subset of AI outputs. But the whole idea of giving outputs that the word that's often thrown around, probably less so today, is like disintermediation. It's like, okay, you get your AI answer and it stops. And then, we're supposedly working out the compensation systems around that, and we're still working them out here 2 years later. So where does this copyright fight, given all of that context, fit into your mind as to how tech power is concentrating, and how important is it to resolve this issue to have a sort of a thriving and healthy free press?
Well, I first want to say I am not an expert on copyright or copyright law. It feels important to say that because the people that are,
Sure. But I know you talk to those people.
I do talk to those people. So I just want to kind of set expectations for your listeners and viewers. But I guess if I were to kind of step back from the situation, you've got this kind of scenario where a handful of firms have come along, gobbled up massive amounts of material on the internet with really no scrutiny on whether they had any claim to that material. No scrutiny really of what the license or rights concerns might have been. And there are various arguments, from the kind of fair use maximalist arguments that the machine has just as much right to read the internet as you or I do, on through to the kind of fair use, I suppose, minimalist or opposition arguments that, in fact, this is the giant theft that has occurred, and put everyone that is a rights holder or a creator in harm's way, effectively kind of crippled them economically. And somewhere in the midst of that debate, there's an enormous amount of litigation, and that is unfolding, as we go along. We just saw a settlement, I think this week with Anthropic, for instance, around
the books, the book lawsuit. Yeah, we're recording that. I should just know we're recording this at the end of August.
Yeah,
so some delays, less than time and space. I'm not sure when this is going to post, but yeah.
Yeah. So, and we've had multiple pieces on Tech Policy Press kind of pointing out the range of litigation, the kind of claims that are at stake, and the types of concerns that appear to be at play. And this does appear to be one that is, at least in the U.S., is going to sort itself out mostly in the courts, unless you believe Congress is magically going to come together and sort this complicated issue out in some new legislation, which I don't anticipate, and I don't think many people do. So here in the courts. But it's not just happening here. It's also, elsewhere in the world. I mean, there are interesting cases in India, Japan, across Europe, et cetera. So this is a key question, I think, that we'll continue to watch for the next few years.
There does seem to be an argument that I think, doesn't quite, there's never a pure argument, right? Because there's something from the government now is like, and when this is honestly the AI companies make this argument, right? Like China's going to overtake us, and therefore they're going to they're never going to respect copyright, so we shouldn't have to either. I think that's, there's the problems with that argument, and we could talk about them. But I also think there's beyond just sort of the fair use, it's the same as humans argument. I think there might be more of a like public good argument almost, in the sense that these training on news and cultural archives, and providing an intelligence, you could make a case that is in the public interest, to have something that people can access. I mean, I don't know if you use these systems much, but there's unquestionable utility in it. Is there like a beyond just even like competing and making sure we quote unquote win in AI? Is there a sort of a public interest argument in terms of the innovation at play here? Like, should there be some leeway given, or just something beyond that that's at least short of like destroying the models, which is a lot of what these lawsuits sort of talk about? I don't know. What are your thoughts on the utility of AI and sort of making sure people can get the benefits of it while still sort of respecting that content compensation side of things?
It feels to me like there's always a big difference between fundamental research and what happens in labs, what happens in universities or even corporate labs to some extent, and then commercialization and what happens once technologies are being deployed in the market. And I suppose on some level, you could make the argument that utilizing vast swaths of the internet to do AI research is perhaps defensible in some fundamental research, primary research kind of way. to arrive at the innovations and the ideas that, can advance the field. But where I think a lot of people would say it becomes more problematic is when we start to see, these models being deployed in ways that then undermine the rights holders and the economy that's been created around rights, and that becomes, where the rubber meets the road. It's the kind of question. I'm very skeptical of these kind of idea that we have to, simply run roughshod over all laws, regulations, or other constraints that might exist because we're locked into an existential race with China. That seems to me to be a kind of, almost a way to stop thinking about these issues rather than to think deeply about them. And so for me, that's not a satisfying way to go about this.
You obviously cover all kinds of tech policy, and as you mentioned at the outset, you've been doing, examining this space, the intersection of tech and the public good for a long time. Are there lessons that we've learned from the past, particularly with respect to the social media age? All the debate around Section 230 and who's liable for what, and content, and the rise of monopolies in these tech spaces. So that we don't repeat the same mistakes as we sort of look for the right AI policies, particularly with respect to media? What are some lessons that we've learned from the past, and are we doing a good job of guarding against those potential pitfalls?
I mean, I think if you look back over the last, if there were, more like media studies, media historians on the podcast right now, they'd probably say much longer than that. But at least over the last 30 years, the interests of industry and the public interests are not the same thing always. And so, if your goal is to create an information environment that is at least somewhat conducive to, democracy and democratic governance, then, just simply going with the kind of answer that industry brings is not going to necessarily deliver you to where you want to get. And I think, if you look back over the last, 30 years especially, there's an argument to be made. We've privatized essentially too much of the internet. We've privatized too much of the information sphere. And, we're now in the process of essentially doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on that in the age of AI. It's not perhaps so much of a coincidence to see, public funding for media in this country being slashed and bottomed out, zeroed out at just the moment we're being told that, artificial intelligence can answer all of our questions in a satisfactory way. I mean, we're in the middle of something pretty extraordinary. And to me, unless we sort that out, the distinction between the industrial interest, the corporate interest, and the public interest, we're going to be in a tight spot.
So it seems to me, if we've privatized too much of it, that by implication, that means there should be probably some more public interest, and if not outright regulation of some of these things. And one of the concerns that often comes up when we talk about this, and I'd really like to get your thoughts on this because it seems like you're in the thick of it, is that, there's the government, they're just not informed, right? Particularly lawmakers. They're just they're still checking email on BlackBerries or something. But I don't know if they are, but that's kind of the joke, is that they just don't really even understand these technologies they're tasked with regulating. Is that the case? What are your thoughts on that specifically, but also how quickly and how properly the government can even respond? Because obviously you get into the whole thing of political interests as well, which certainly we're seeing a lot of these days.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll use my response to this to kind of maybe say a couple things. One, I don't think necessarily government is always the answer to delivering the public interest. So I want to be clear about that. It's all about equilibria. It feels to me that, there are circumstances where governments are, more trustworthy and perhaps operate more in the interests of their citizens, and can be trusted on some level to hold industry to account, and to make good decisions that don't limit free expression and promote a plural media environment, et cetera. And there are other circumstances where governments can't be trusted to do those things. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. So I don't want to position myself as sort of arguing that government is always the answer.
What about the fundamental problem, though, like I said, of like just a misunderstanding or not enough knowledge on the part of regulators and lawmakers?
I mean, absolutely. I think that this is a key problem that's always existed with regard to new tech and legislation, regulation, et cetera. And, to some extent, I think that's what we're trying to do at Tech Policy Press is, advance good thinking on these things in a way that is useful to policymakers and is, somewhere between, the academic journal that may be inaccessible or the think tank report that takes too long to read and, maybe more straightforward news reporting that may gloss over important details that policymakers need to understand. But, in this country, look at the situation we're in. We're kind of gutting regulatory agencies. We're destroying the apparatus of science, which is necessary to look into these things and to think deeply about them. We are destroying the independence of our regulatory agencies. So there's not a lot of hope, I think, at the moment, in the near term, in the U.S. at least, that we're going to necessarily overcome that.
Well, one thing in the current administration is there's definitely, it seems to me anyway, as an observer and as a tech journalist, that there are stronger ties now between sort of at least some of Silicon Valley and the current White House. I think we can agree. There's like, just look at the inauguration, but also there's some key appointments, particularly in the way in the field of AI. You have David Sachs, who's kind of the AI czar in the administration now. So in my mind, that sort of like addresses a bit of sort of what the concern I was talking about. Oh, you're getting these sort of industry folks helping influence decision making, but that has issues too, right? So while that seems like a sort of decent step in the right direction, how do you think that should be balanced to ensure that like it's not just sort of the industry pulling the strings?
Well, you can look at this in so many different ways, but, maybe I'll just pick one issue in particular. If you look at where we're at on AI infrastructure and the debate over that in this country, in the last few weeks, there have been various efforts in the administration, the AI action plan, the executive order, other actions that have been taken to essentially sort of steamroll any kind of obstacle to the development of more AI infrastructure, to include, relaxing environmental reviews and making a big focus on increasing fossil fuel production and energy capacity to deliver on the energy needs of data centers, et cetera. And a lot of that ends up being, to the detriment of local voices, community figures, zoning review processes, public utility commissions, whatever, that may have hitherto had a role in deciding, how things work in particular jurisdictions. So you end up handing the industry more power over what it can do and how it can effectively kind of terraform, parts of communities to its circumstances or to its needs. In my view, like that is a good example, I think, of kind of where we're at the moment, that we're taking power away from people in terms of setting their own direction, deciding, how they would like to be involved in these matters, and essentially saying, that's none of your business. We're going to set a federal standard and make certain that the industry's interests are the prime ones. And often that justification for that, the logic for that, again, goes back to the thing you brought up earlier, which is, we've got to beat China, which is hot on our heels.
Right. Seems like, Yeah, that's always sort of comes back to that, and let's go fast, fast, fast. Steering it a little bit more back towards sort of the media environment, but keeping with the theme of regulators. So one of the sort of big things that seems to be, could even be bipartisan, really, is this distrust of monopolies, and we've seen that I think come to fruition with regard to Google and a lot of the antitrust findings and the cases against it, and now we're looking at what the remedies will be, and we still don't know at this point. Here it is, like end of August, but seems like something's going to happen. Um, I would like to talk about that for a bit because it seems like this has the potential. There's a lot of speculation going on now, and like, are they going to get rid of Chrome? They're going to be forced to divest certain assets. What does that mean for the AI strategy? And I want to sort of know, or at least think about, like how that trickles down to publishers and the media. So, with all these rulings, like how does this alter Google's sort of bargaining power here, and what is the potential for that to potentially create almost maybe potentially a better future in some way in the media environment? Because Google, of course, has sort of ruled the roost in regard to search results and distribution for quite a long time. And I don't know. I think people aren't in a hurry to sort of see that replicated in the AI world that we're sort of rapidly heading into. So I don't know your thoughts on the antitrust, the result, and what you think would be sort of the most beneficial outcome of all this.
Yeah, so I don't know if I necessarily have a kind of any druthers here, like
Right.
in terms of the specific outcome. Like you, as a journalist, I'm waiting to see what happens with the remedies trial and the outcome. I don't know when this will be published, but I think many of us were expecting, the decision sometime, any minute, right? It could be today, it could be tomorrow, et cetera. So we'll see. I guess the main thing for your listeners, your viewers, is that this is potentially shifting tectonic plates. Could be potentially the most important kind of antitrust decision we've seen in quite some time in the United States. But still to be seen. To me, I think that it does come down to this question of will the kind of scale of these companies ultimately be regarded as kind of unassailable or unimpeachable, or are these types of interventions possible? And it could have huge knock-on effects for publishers and for the economy of the internet, and certainly for the future of AI. It's interesting. I was reading a Jeffrey Fowler piece in the Washington Post today where they asked a bunch of librarians to review, AI tools to determine, how they perform on certain information gathering tasks. And there was a line in there. I'm not going to quote it directly, but something like, "Turns out the AI Google killer is Google." Just the extent to which Google's AI is really performing exceedingly
Right.
well. And folks, I think a year or two ago kind of thought, oh, well, maybe OpenAI's got a shot at really unseating the champ, and we'll see. It does feel like that's a very still contested space, and we'll see. But I think many people would look at the scenario now and say Google doesn't look quite as vulnerable as perhaps it might have appeared to be, right after the launch of ChatGPT or something along those lines.
Totally.
So we'll see what happens. It feels to me like we are at a pivot point, and who knows what it will mean for Google. If a divestment comes along that will change the internet enormously. We've seen a couple of these bids to buy Chrome, Perplexity. I think OpenAI maybe even mentioned that it would be interested. I don't know how serious those are. They might be more about making noise than really anything. But yeah, I mean, it appears it's all up in the air.
Well, thanks for bringing up sort of like the utility of these things and how it's being worked on the ground level, because I definitely wanted to ask about your thoughts on hallucinations and just the overall quality of the information we're going to be getting out of all this. So it seems kind of inevitable, at least it seems that way, that we're kind of heading towards a world where AI is providing a lot of the information. This is kind of like the first stop, and it's going like, a big chunk of like just getting info from the internet is going to be done through these AI engines. But, the hallucinations do seem to be inherent to the technology. They sometimes get stuff wrong. Like, we're getting better and better at weeding them out, but it's not like a thing that is disappeared. In fact, there's some studies that show it's getting worse for these thinking models. We'll see what happens with that. Obviously, I write about this often, and it's in the media. Accuracy is the product. It's kind of like we need it, so it sort of limits the utility to some extent from media institutions directly, but also there is this trend of like that is inevitable, right? Like people are just getting it. They love the utility of it, even if it gets things wrong. So, I sometimes write about this sort of fuzziness that's starting to arise. Like it's good enough, and that's what society is sort of concluding to. And I don't know how much the media can really get in front of that or alter that course. How do you think we can steer toward, like, obviously neither of us are technical people, whether hallucinations get figured out or not, open question. But assuming we have to live with them, are disclosures enough? Is there some like, what can we do about it, I guess, is the kind of the point. And what does it even say about the media, its importance, and the importance of accuracy just in our society?
These are huge questions. I wish I had the answers to them, Pete.
So do I. Let's talk about it.
I will say, your question prompts many things in my mind. One is, I think I share the same fear that you appear to have in the kind of thinking behind your question, which is that we end up in this kind of world of approximations and fuzziness, which in many cases is fine. But in some cases could be catastrophic. And so that, perhaps you might argue we've always been in that world. There was we've always, as a species, existed in a stew of nonsense and, rumor and propaganda and, various interests, et cetera. So maybe on some macro level, it's not so different than where it was in the past. And yet we've, for the last few decades at least, had this kind of commitment to the idea of trying to get things right, to be accurate, to follow some Enlightenment principle, to be hypothesis oriented and try to verify things and, et cetera, et cetera. But that may be less important to most people than we think it is, that you and I think it is, right? I'll share just one anecdote, and this may seem a little bit kind of out of nowhere, but I was talking to someone recently who was telling me about someone that they knew who had a long commute, and they had always listened to public radio on the commute, to the news in particular. They listened to the talk programs. And this person told me that this person on the commute had said to them, they don't do that anymore. Instead, they talk to ChatGPT. And they have wide-ranging conversations on that long commute. They ask about issues, they ask about things, they talk about other matters. And I don't know, it just really crystallized in my mind the possibilities in terms of just the changing of habits and behaviors in terms of the way people receive information. But also possibly a kind of maybe gets at a little bit of a misunderstanding we sometimes have in the media about the value that we provide. At least for that one individual, maybe he wasn't listening to NPR because he wanted information. Maybe it was because he just wanted someone to keep him awake in the car. And, now he's got a better application for that. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's so much happening here. I don't know quite where we're going to head. But it does strike me that some of the phenomena we're seeing right now, and there's been a lot in the press over the last few weeks about risks of AI chatbots, AI companions, about AI psychosis, this new phrase that's kind of come into the lexicon over the last bit. There are also some extremely concerning bits of this that go beyond questions, epistemic questions. They go into kind of the relationship between, the user and the AI, and whether that will necessarily be healthy in certain circumstances and for certain types of individuals. So I don't know. There's so many questions right now that feel like they're open and we're just scratching the surface of.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, what you described as your person's evolving habits, and on the surface of that, you would think, oh man, that sucks for NPR, and it does. It's just that for a chatbot companion to be helpful in the multiple contexts that the person would want, I mean, it's going to need information. It's like for whatever the person's talking about, at some point, it's either training or going out in real time to find information to respond to whatever they're talking about. And if you think about that, well, that actually opens up like a lot of opportunity for information providers to if there's enough development of the handshakes that have to happen along the way and compensation systems and whatnot. Maybe that's an opportunity. Again, we're in the early days. Like, how does that happen? But I think about this often now that I'm actively using consumer agents. So there's Perplexity as a browser. I talk about it often in that, oh, now you can have your agent go out and do things while you do something else. And it's like, oh, well, it needs context to do those things. And it's searching the web constantly. But then that's sort of like, if you think about the natural endpoint of this, it turns the media into the raw information provider, like the wholesaler, and then like it's basically being licensed in either in real time or in broader deals to this AI layer. I don't know, like that's one possibility for what the media looks like in, I guess, 2035 or however long we want to project it out. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that scenario or other alternate scenarios? Like what do you think a healthy ecosystem would look like? And is that kind of information providing to AI chatbots kind of a part of it? If you were to, again, put on your crystal ball hat and think about like what a healthy media ecosystem looks like in an AI mediated world.
Yeah. Again, another huge question. I guess I'll just say, I could kind of go back to the idea of equilibria. We want some kind of equilibrium between the tech firms on the one hand, between government on the other, between, the interests, the moneyed interests that want to manipulate the information environment or lead people to certain types of conclusions. We want civil society and universities and other types of institutions to, be able to be represented in the information environment, to bring new ideas forward, to provoke, quality debate and to advance values like pluralism. How do we get that? Maybe the scenario we've had for the last 100 years, maybe that's not it. This world of publishers and platforms and, kind of government, intermediaries on some level. It's possible to imagine a lot of things happening. I don't know what will happen, but, one thing, for instance, who knows? Maybe one of these, and I thought about this again, not to go back to this Jeffrey Fowler piece more than once, but in the piece he was talking about, which of the bots did better at surfacing current information. And, to the extent that that becomes important to people, if Google's better at it or ChatGPT's better at it, it's not impossible to imagine one of these AI firms saying, actually, you know what? It would be incidental for us to hire 5,000 journalists and to start our own newsroom. Think about Bloomberg as a model, right? I mean, it's a information technology company in many ways that happens to also employ a lot of journalists because it needs to push information through to its clients and to satisfy other interests that it has. It's not hard to imagine one of the other firms deciding that it wants to do that or cut out the middleman. It's done making all these licensing deals with, these old entities like the Associated Press or what have you. On the other hand, it's possible that maybe we do reach a different equilibrium where the value of that news and information becomes apparent and consistent, and people are paying it in ways that, set them apart from their competitors. I don't know. I'll just say one last thing about this, which is I do know one thing that we want to try to preserve, which is some kind of adversarial role for the media. But it may be that entities exist or come into being or are bolstered that already exist that aren't traditional journalism organizations that can do some of that work. Some of it can be done through transparency or public watchdog groups or even government boards or oversight entities at local level, that type of thing. I don't know. But it's possible to imagine a different equilibrium, certainly from the one we have now, that does work and is kind of, satisfying democratic interests, small d democratic interests, but it feels still far off.
Nice. But just to wrap things up, I think that's a great vision, that to have that equilibrium among several things and sort of on the conceptual level that you sort of articulated. If you had to bring it back to sort of the present and sort of like, what is like, I guess, the most important lever you could pull today, whether it's a law, it could be just some kind of market norm, or even some flaw or direction in the products, the AI stuff that's being built today. Like what if you could just steer one thing, like to keep that equilibrium, to sort of see that we sort of at least make a good faith effort to step toward that sort of balanced vision, what would it be?
I do think competition policy, antitrust, I think those are, about really moving the tectonic plates. You brought that up, expecting this Google remedies result. But, there's also a lot afoot in Europe, and, with the Digital Markets Act, and seeing what happens here in the U.S. With the FTC and with various cases against Meta and Google and Apple and others. We'll see what happens. But to the extent that governments are willing to hold these companies to some standard and to think about how to create a competitive environment that does create a kind of flourishing of the public interest and not just the industry's interest, what is this all for? Why are we creating companies to begin with? I mean, why are we capitalizing these activities, if not hopefully to lead us to a more just, equitable, sustainable, and democratic future? Unfortunately, I don't know that is necessarily a goal that is agreed upon by much of society, but certainly not necessarily by every government. And so we'll just see what happens. But I would think that is the area to watch, is competition and antitrust. And again, I hate to say it, but it goes back to your thing about China, your early question. There appears to be a kind of, mentality that we need things to be as big as they can be, because that's the only way that we'll win this existential race towards quote unquote super intelligence, the ultimate advantage. And hey, who can say on that one? But it strikes me as an enormous bet to be making with our democracies.
Right. Yeah. Going big, I mean, it's understandable, but it can't be the only thing we're going for. I totally get it. Justin, it's been great. So thank you so much for the time. It's been a really illuminating conversation.
Pete, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Justin Hendrix of Tech Policy Press. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you just take a minute to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, PR professionals, and communicators. Seeing you